Willow Creek had always been a quiet town, one of those places where everyone knows everyone and nothing strange happens aside from some local gossip. However, that October morning, something in the air felt different. The wind, cold and biting, carried with it a sense of unease that no one could explain. Dylan, a young journalist for the local newspaper, woke up to the persistent sound of tapping on his bedroom window. When he opened the curtains, he was confronted by a solitary raven perched on the edge of the window, pecking at the glass with a disturbing intensity. He tried to shoo the bird away, but the raven merely tilted its head as if it were watching his every move. Dylan felt a chill run down his spine. There was something deeply wrong with that bird. As he left the house, he noticed he wasn't the only one aware of the growing presence of ravens. They were everywhere, in the trees, on the lampposts, silently watching the town's residents like dark sentinels of something yet to come. At the newspaper office, Dylan found his colleagues discussing the sudden increase in the raven population. "It's the weather," said the editor-in-chief, dismissing any suggestion of something supernatural. But Dylan couldn't shake off the fixed stare of that raven at his window. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Alice, a retired teacher, was walking her dog when she heard the distinctive sound of wings flapping. Looking up, she saw a cloud of ravens flying in circles over an old abandoned house. The noise was deafening, and Alice, frightened, quickened her pace to return home. However, before she reached her door, she heard a desperate scream coming from inside the abandoned house. That same night, the mutilated body of a teenager was found near the house. The local police, led by Detective Harrington, tried to contain the panic, claiming it was a wild animal attack. But as the news spread, the feeling that something terrible was happening took hold of Willow Creek. The ravens continued to gather. Their black figures became part of the town's daily life, and fear seeped into homes, in whispers between neighbors, in windows closed even before sunset. The behavior of the birds was just the beginning. With each passing night, another life was taken brutally, and the town would soon realize that this was not merely animals acting on instinct. Dylan, now obsessed with the mystery, began investigating the murders and their connection to the ravens. His nights were spent awake, studying ancient legends and trying to find some explanation. But the deeper he dug, the more terrifying the revelations became. The town had a dark past, buried under layers of silence and forgetfulness, and the ravens, those messengers of darkness, were there to remind everyone of what was about to be unleashed. As Halloween approached, the deaths became more violent and the ravens bolder. Somehow, Dylan knew that the key to everything lay in that abandoned house, the starting point of the terror. Something evil was about to be unleashed, and the town of Willow Creek was not prepared to face the horror that was approaching. Autumn in Willow Creek had always been a time of tranquility, when the orange leaves and the cold air brought a melancholic calm. However, as Halloween drew near, that stillness felt suffocating, as if every resident was on the edge of a precipice. Dylan, now more involved than ever in the investigation, felt the discomfort growing inside him. He could no longer distinguish whether it was the atmosphere of the town or something within his own mind that was beginning to deteriorate. The ravens had not left the town. On the contrary, their presence was becoming increasingly unsettling. They were no longer just passive observers. Now, they followed Dylan. He noticed it on the streets, on his way to work, and even on the rare occasions when he tried to relax at a local cafe. There was always one raven or several, perched, staring at him with their cold, intelligent eyes. That night, the silence of the town was oppressive. Dylan's footsteps echoed through the deserted streets as he walked back home, feeling a weight in his chest that he could barely explain. At every corner, something seemed to watch him from the shadows. It was as if the ravens were in the alleyways, in the trees, and worse still, within the very darkness surrounding Willow Creek. The sound of a raven's wings sliced through the air, causing Dylan to flinch instinctively. He looked around but saw nothing but the dense fog that now covered the town like a suffocating blanket. An unnecessary chill enveloped him, and as he tried to hurry home, he stumbled. Looking down, his heart raced. There was a small pile of black feathers, as if some raven had died there. But upon touching them, he noticed something strange. The feathers felt warm, and a sticky sensation coursed through his fingers. Blood. Dylan recoiled, looking around in panic, but the ravens were no longer just on rooftops or posts. He could hear them around him, closer, as if they were surrounding him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to fall, to surrender to fear. He ran. He didn't know exactly where to go. He only knew he needed to escape that oppressive feeling, those eyes that haunted him. When he finally reached the door of his house, trembling and gasping, he hurriedly turned the key and entered, locking the door behind him. But the sound of wings flapping, always present, seemed to be outside, like an entity he couldn't shake off. As he sat down at his desk, trying to calm his nerves, he began to review the notes on the murders. The pattern was clear. Whenever the crows started behaving more aggressively, a new victim was found. It couldn't be a coincidence. But there was something more. Something he was neglecting. And then, a previously insignificant detail began to hammer in his mind. The abandoned house. All the events seemed to revolve around it. The first victim was found nearby, and all the reports of strange behavior from the crows seemed to converge at that place. Dylan knew he had to go back there, but the fear he felt was not rational. It was something primitive, visceral, that told him to stay away, not to challenge whatever was lurking in that house. As he struggled against his own rationality, a sudden and loud knock echoed through the house. Dylan froze. The knocks came again, this time more insistently. It seemed to come from the window. As he slowly got up, a sense of absolute terror consumed him. He somehow knew what was waiting for him on the other side. Even so, his feet carried him to the window, and when he finally gathered the courage to open the curtains, his blood ran cold. There, perched on the ledge, was the largest crow he had ever seen. Its feathers were as black as night itself, and its lifeless eyes stared at Dylan with a disturbing intelligence. For a moment, it seemed the bird was smiling, a subtle and terrifying gesture. Then, before he could react, the crow flapped its wings and disappeared into the darkness. That night, Dylan dreamed of crows. He dreamed that they surrounded him, pecking at his skin, tearing his sanity apart piece by piece. He woke up in a cold sweat, but the nightmare seemed to extend beyond sleep. Upon opening his eyes, he still heard the sound of wings, smelled death and blood in the air. The crows had chosen their prey, and Dylan knew he was on the list. The next morning, Dylan's face was haggard. The deep circles under his eyes and the lack of sleep began to reflect in his posture and the disconnected way he spoke. When he arrived at the precinct, he found Sarah, the medical examiner, already waiting with new information about the latest victim. She watched him closely, frowning. "You look terrible, Dylan," Sarah said, concerned. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated for a moment. He wanted to tell the truth, to talk about the knocks, the crows, the horrible dream that seemed endless. But how could he explain something so irrational? "It wasn't a good night," he replied vaguely, scratching his face with a trembling hand. Sarah, however, was not so easily convinced. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of concern. "Listen, this investigation is affecting all of us. If you need help, anything, I'm here." Her eyes conveyed sincerity, but also a slight discomfort. It was as if she, too, was being affected by the dark weight hanging over Willow Creek. Before Dylan could respond, the phone on his desk rang, and the urgent voice of the police chief came through on the other end. "Dylan, another body has been found. Come to the scene immediately." He felt a chill. The crows. He knew something terrible was about to happen. The crime scene was even worse than the previous ones. On the muddy ground, the body was mutilated in a way that made Dylan's stomach churn. There was something ritualistic about the cuts, as if it were not just a murder, but a kind of macabre offering. And around the body, scattered black feathers. Crows, always crows. Sarah, kneeling beside the body, examined the wounds with a serious expression. She looked paler than usual, and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to take pictures of the marks. "What is this?" Dylan asked, staring at the feathers. "This isn't normal. It can't be a coincidence." Sarah sighed, hesitant to respond. "I don't know, Dylan, but something is deeply wrong here. The marks, the feathers, they seem to indicate a kind of ritual." She looked at him with wide eyes. "Have you ever felt like we're being watched? As if something, or someone, is watching us closely?" Dylan shivered. Sarah's question echoed in his own thoughts. He looked around, sensing the invisible weight of the crows, even though none were present at that moment. The air seemed heavy, as if nature itself was conspiring against them. "Do you think this is related to the abandoned house?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, fearing that even mentioning the house could awaken something. Sarah paused for a moment, staring into the void before slowly nodding. "Yes. I've been there, a few months ago before all this started. I heard things, Dylan. Voices. Sounds that shouldn't be there. Since then, I've been having constant nightmares." Dylan felt himself sink. If even Sarah, so rational and skeptical, was being affected. What did that mean? What exactly were they facing? "We need to go back there," he said, trying to sound determined, but the fear in his voice was evident. "There's something in that house, something that's connecting all of this. The crows, the murders, the nightmares." Sarah slowly stood up, wiping her hands on her pants as if trying to brush off the feeling of something evil clinging to her. "I'll go with you, but Dylan, we can't go alone. We need more people, more eyes. Something is hunting us, and I don't think we'll come out of this town whole." By dusk, Dylan, Sarah, and 2 other police officers arrived at the abandoned house. The place looked even darker than the last time Dylan had been there. The weathered facade and broken windows seemed to watch the group, like soulless eyes. The cold wind blew, carrying the distant sound of crows cawing, though none were in sight. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" asked one of the officers, Mike, as he held the flashlight with a trembling hand. He was new in town and clearly not prepared for what was to come. Dylan tried to remain calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. "We have no choice," he replied. "If we want to find out what's happening, we need to start here." They entered. The smell of mold and decay was strong, almost suffocating. The floorboards creaked under their feet, and the sound echoed through the empty house, making everyone even more alert. As they moved forward, a growing sense of unease enveloped the group. In the main corridor, Sarah suddenly stopped. She was trembling, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "Hear that?" Her voice was a frightened whisper. They all stopped. A distant sound, like a low wailing, almost indistinguishable, echoed through the walls of the house. It didn't sound human. It was a drawn-out lament, as if it came from a throat that shouldn't be able to produce sounds. "What is that?" Mike murmured, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. Before Dylan could respond, the sound changed. The wailing morphed into a distorted, grotesque laughter, echoing down the corridor. The flashlight beams began to flicker. The crows outside started cawing intensely, as if responding to a call from within the house. And then, something moved in the shadows. Dylan caught only a glimpse. A figure, tall and hunched, with eyes that glowed in the darkness like those of an animal. A chill of absolute terror ran down his spine. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and he felt that fear was about to consume his sanity. "Let's get out of here," one of the officers shouted, and everyone, including Dylan, began to retreat. But before they could reach the door, it slammed shut with a bang. The sound of laughter echoed again, now louder, and the crows outside began beating their wings against the broken windows, as if trying to get in. The nightmare had truly begun. The sound of wings beating against the windows echoed through the house like an incessant rain, creating a suffocating feeling. The air was heavy, and each breath felt like a titanic effort. The distorted laughter echoing through the walls had transformed into a constant, penetrating hum, almost as if it were being whispered directly into their minds. Dylan looked around, trying to stay calm, but the growing terror was palpable. Sarah, by his side, seemed paralyzed, her gaze fixed on the darkness ahead, unable to look away. The other 2 officers, Mike and Jerry, were in a state of complete panic. Mike was already starting to pound against the door, banging his shoulder against it in vain, trying to force it open. Jerry was just murmuring something to himself, his eyes wide as if on the verge of a breakdown. This can't be happening. This isn't real, Mike shouted, delivering another desperate blow against the door, which wouldn't budge. Dylan knew something more sinister was at play. He felt as if the house were alive, as if the evil they had awakened were toying with their minds, driving them to the brink of madness. He needed to think, needed to find a way out before it was too late. "Everyone, stick together," Dylan ordered, trying to sound firm, but his own voice trembled. "Let's not separate. Whatever is here wants us to scatter." Sarah took a hesitant step toward Dylan, her whole body shaking. She could barely form words. "Dylan, we need to get out of here now." Her voice was weak, almost inaudible, and there was a depth of fear in her eyes that he had never seen before. Dylan nodded, but the feeling of helplessness overwhelmed him. The door was locked, the windows were too small for them to escape through, and the surroundings seemed to be closing in, as if the house were tightening its grip around them. "We need to try the basement. Maybe there's an exit down there," he suggested, though the idea of going deeper into that cursed house sent chills down his spine. Mike, still banging on the door, paused for a moment and looked at Dylan as if he were crazy. "The basement? Have you lost your mind, man? That's suicide. We're gonna get killed. Staying here will get us killed too," Dylan retorted, his voice rising with panic. "We need an exit, and the basement might be the only option." Before there could be more discussions, a deep sound reverberated throughout the house. Something was moving upstairs, on the upper floors. It was a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled slowly, causing the floorboards to creak under the weight. What is that?" Jerry murmured, now completely terrified, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above. Dylan exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, and they both knew there was no time left for discussions. Whatever was up there was getting closer. He nodded to Mike and Jerry, indicating that they should move forward. Reluctantly, but driven by fear, they began to descend the narrow staircase leading to the basement. Each step creaked, amplifying the feeling of vulnerability. The basement was shrouded in darkness, and Dylan's flashlight seemed unable to penetrate enough to reveal what lay below. The smell of dampness and decay was even stronger, almost unbearable. When they finally reached the cold cement floor, they realized that the basement was vast, much larger than it appeared from outside. Sarah held onto Dylan's arm tightly, trying to contain the rising panic. "Dylan, something is wrong here. This doesn't make sense. The house from the outside isn't that big. What is this place?" Dylan had no answers. The space in front of him seemed to stretch infinitely, a labyrinth of darkness that shouldn't exist. He knew they had entered something much larger than just a haunted house. There was a presence there, something ancient and deeply malevolent. In the distance, the sound of something moving in the dark made them stop. It wasn't the same sound as before. It was closer, more urgent, as if they were being hunted. "We can't stay here," Dylan said, trying to stay calm. "We need to move forward, fast." They began to cross the basement, the flashlights flickering intermittently. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound echoed off the walls like a wicked whisper. As they advanced, something caught Dylan's attention, an old wooden door, partially open, at the back of the basement. "There," he pointed, feeling a mix of hope and terror. If there was an exit, it would be there. But at the same time, something about that door deeply unsettled him. As if by opening it, they were about to unleash something much worse. Sarah looked at the door with the same suspicion. "Dylan, we have to think carefully. What if we're walking straight into a trap?" Before they could decide, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed again, this time closer. It was a presence they couldn't see, but they could feel. Something was coming, something that wouldn't let them leave alive. With no other options, Dylan grabbed the doorknob and pushed the door open. What he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. It wasn't an exit. It wasn't the freedom he had hoped for. On the other side of the door was a tunnel, dug into the earth, filled with strange markings on the walls. ancient, incomprehensible symbols that pulsed with a dark energy. "This can't be here," Sarah whispered, instinctively backing away. But before they could react, a deafening sound filled the basement. A giant crow, with red eyes and feathers black as night, emerged from the shadows of the tunnel, cawing in a tone that seemed like a hellish lament. Its wings opened, blocking any hope of escape. The group stood paralyzed. The terror they had faced until now seemed insignificant compared to what they were witnessing. The abyss had looked back. Dylan couldn't breathe. The air around him was thick, charged with electricity, as if the world itself were about to collapse. The sound of the crows cawing grew louder, echoing off the walls of the small cabin where he and Sarah were hiding. They had found temporary refuge, but both knew it wouldn't last. The crows were waiting, watching, as if they knew their time was near. Sarah, trembling with fear, gripped Dylan's arm tightly. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window. Outside, the darkness moved strangely, as if it were alive. "What is happening? What do they want from us?" Her voice was a whisper, almost inaudible, but filled with dread. Dylan had no answers. He was also on the brink of collapse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bodies of the other townspeople scattered throughout the city, mangled in ways that defied any logical explanation. He had witnessed something deeper, something worse. The shadows of the crows seemed to grow, taking on human form, distorting and moving as if they were controlling the very environment around them. "This isn't natural, Dylan," Sarah continued. "These crows, they're not just birds." Dylan knew she was right. Something inside him, a primal instinct, screamed that this wasn't just a series of inexplicable events. It was a ritual. He remembered the symbols carved into the walls of the abandoned church, the ancient books that mentioned sacrifices, and how the murders had begun shortly after the crows' strange behavior. They weren't there by chance. They were preparing the ground for something much darker. Suddenly, a deep sound echoed through the air, a sound that shouldn't exist. A long, agonizing wail seemed to emanate from the very ground. Dylan and Sarah looked around, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing but darkness outside. Then, one of the window panes shattered with a deafening crack, and a cloud of crows invaded the cabin, their dark wings flapping violently, filling the space with chaos and darkness. Dylan grabbed Sarah and pulled her to the floor, trying to shield her with his body as the crows circled, tearing at the curtains and knocking over furniture. Amid the chaos, Dylan heard a different sound, a voice. But it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was something ancient and deep, as if it came from within his own mind. "The last seal has been broken." Dylan's heart nearly stopped. He didn't know where the voice was coming from, but the meaning was clear. The ritual was almost complete. The town was about to plunge into an abyss of terror that no one could stop. And he was responsible. Unwittingly, unknowingly, he had broken the balance. The crows began to retreat, but not in a normal way. They moved in unison, organized like a swarm obeying an invisible command. And then, in the middle of the room, the darkness took shape. A tall, hooded figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a cold, cruel light. Dylan felt his body freeze, as if all his instincts were telling him to run, but he was trapped, powerless before the presence. "You have broken the seal," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the room, dense and grave. "Now, the price will be paid, the city will fall, and you will become part of the eternal cycle." Dylan tried to speak, but his words were lost. He looked at Sarah, but she was paralyzed, her wide eyes fixed on the figure. The terror in her eyes mirrored the dread Dylan felt. There was nowhere to run. There was no salvation. The figure stepped forward, and the crows followed, like an extension of its own will. "You are not the first, nor will you be the last. The crow is the guardian, and now it is free. All the sacrifices have led to this moment." The ground began to tremble, and the walls of the cabin seemed to bend under the pressure of that entity's presence. The air grew so heavy that breathing became impossible. Dylan knew they were facing the end. The seal that kept them safe was destroyed, and the true horror that the city had harbored was about to be unleashed. In a last surge of courage, he grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We need to get out of here. Now," he shouted, trying to overcome the terror that consumed him. But outside, the sky was covered with crows. Thousands, perhaps millions, formed a black carpet that covered the horizon, cawing in unison, announcing the end. As Dylan and Sarah ran through the devastated town, they knew there was nowhere to escape. The ritual was complete. And now, the crows would bring the end of the city, an end they could not prevent. Dylan and Sarah ran through the empty streets of the town, breathless, with the crows following them like living shadows, ever present. The houses around them seemed to crumble under the weight of the evil that permeated the air. The sky, once tinged with a strange Halloween light, was now completely black, a void without stars, without hope. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees on the uneven stone street. Dylan stopped, exhausted, but pulled her back. Their eyes met, and he saw defeat reflected there, like in a mirror. "We can't run anymore, Dylan," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They've already won." Dylan shook his head, refusing to believe. "It's not over yet. It can't end like this. There has to be something more. There must be a way to stop this." He looked around, but all he saw were shadows and the crows, watching, waiting. The sound of their wings was like a sinister clock, marking the countdown to the end. On the horizon, a familiar figure emerged from the mist. The same hooded entity they had seen in the cabin was now approaching them with a terrible calm. Its steps were silent, but each movement seemed to make the ground tremble. Dylan felt the pressure in his lungs increase as the figure drew near. It was as if all the air around had been sucked into that presence. Sarah slowly stood up, her eyes glazed as if she were hypnotized by the sight. Dylan grabbed her arm, trying to pull her from her stupor. "Sarah, no! Stay with me!" But she did not hear him. Her mind was consumed by the absolute terror of the situation. Dylan knew they were reaching their limit. The dread was no longer just psychological, it was palpable, an overwhelming force that was breaking them from within. The figure stopped a few meters from them, its black silhouette contrasting with the thick fog. The hood obscured its face, but Dylan felt the presence of something ancient and wicked behind that darkness. The silence between them was suffocating. "You ran," said the entity, its voice like metal tearing flesh. "But there is no escape. The city has already been sealed by fate. The crows are the harbinger of what is to come, and what is to come will be eternal." Dylan stepped forward, trying to keep his voice steady, but it trembled in his throat. "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this?" The figure remained still for a moment, as if considering the question. "You are nothing but pieces in the grand cycle. This city, this place, has always been a portal. The crows are just the messengers. And now the way is open. Darkness will come and consume everything." Sarah finally snapped out of her trance, her voice trembling. "Why? Why us?" The entity tilted its head as if it found the question intriguing. "Why not you? The sacrifice has been made, the signs have been fulfilled. You broke the seal. And now, the price must be paid." Dylan felt a chill take over his body. Everything made sense now. The city had been doomed long before they realized it. They were merely pawns in something much larger, something that had been preparing for centuries. He looked at Sarah, and she returned the gaze, desperate, but something in her expression had changed. There was a determination there, a spark of resistance he hadn't noticed before. "We're not just going to give up," she said, her voice low but firm. Dylan nodded. They couldn't run, but maybe they could fight. "What do you mean by eternal cycle?" Dylan asked, trying to keep the enemy talking. Every second gained was a chance to think, a chance to survive. The figure approached slowly, its feet making no sound on the ground. "This world, this reality, is not the only one. There are other places, beyond time, beyond comprehension. You are trapped in a cycle. The city was chosen to be the breaking point. The seal that kept the forces from the other side was broken by you, and now the cycle begins anew. What you call reality will be consumed." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently. Cracks started to form in the asphalt, and from within them, a red, pulsating light emerged. as if hell itself was about to swallow everything around. The local apocalypse had begun. The crows flew en masse, forming a spiral in the sky, their cries now almost unbearable, a cacophony that tore at the minds of those who heard. The shadows around the city began to move, taking shape, gaining consistency. The figures of the dead rose from the darkness, their faces twisted in despair, crying out for salvation. Dylan and Sarah were at the epicenter of chaos, surrounded by forces beyond their understanding. Yet, even so, something within them refused to yield. They were on the brink of destruction, but still alive. "The cycle can be broken," the entity said, its voice reverberating through the air. "But for that, you must make the final sacrifice." Dylan looked at Sarah, and she understood immediately. One of us must die to seal the portal. The decision lay before them. They both knew there was no escape without one of them making a sacrifice. But what would they do? Who would be willing to pay the ultimate price to save the city, or at least delay the inevitable? The ground trembled violently beneath Dylan and Sarah's feet. The cracks in the asphalt continued to widen, swallowing everything around in a vortex of destruction. The sky, once merely dark, now pulsed with an intense red light, as if something was about to break through the boundaries of reality. The crows, in their hundreds, circled above them, their black feathers reflecting the sinister glow emanating from the depths. It was the end. The evil they had awakened was about to take over the city, and possibly the world. Dylan looked at Sarah, panic evident in her eyes, but there was also a grim resolution. They knew there was no turning back. The entity, still standing before them, now seemed larger, denser, as if it were absorbing the very energy of the chaos around. "The choice is yours," the entity said, its voice reverberating like thunder. "One of you must yield to the darkness. Only with this sacrifice can the cycle be interrupted." Dylan's heart raced. He wanted to fight, wanted to find another way out, but the truth surrounded him like a suffocating prison. Sarah knew it too. They were trapped in a snare, and the only way to escape, even if temporarily, was through sacrifice. But who would have the courage to surrender? Dylan held Sarah's hand tightly, and she squeezed back, her eyes locked on his. "I can't let you do this, Dylan," she said, her voice choked but firm. "I can't live knowing you died to save me." He shook his head, trying to control the emotions that crushed him inside. "And I can't let you die, Sarah. Not like this. Not for something we started together." She closed her eyes, trying to hold back tears, but when she opened them, there was a cold determination. They knew their love was strong, but the darkness demanded a high price. The shadows around them closed in tighter, the dead walking toward them, their distorted screams filling the air, as if pleading for the choice to be made. "Time was running out. If we don't choose soon, we'll both die." "And the city too," Dylan said, feeling the pressure mount. The ground beneath them was already starting to crack more, threatening to swallow everything around. Sarah then made a decision Dylan would never accept. She suddenly let go of his hand, running toward the hooded entity. "I'll do it," she shouted, her voice full of determination. "If this is what will save everyone, I accept." "No," Dylan shouted, but his feet felt frozen to the ground, as if the darkness itself was holding him back. He tried to move forward, but it was too late. Sarah stopped in front of the entity, her body tense but her mind resolute. "If it is a sacrifice you want, I am the chosen one." The entity tilted its head as if pondering. "The sacrifice must be voluntary," it said, its voice heavy with ancient power. "Only then will the cycle be broken." For now, Dylan struggled against the invisible force holding him in place, desperately trying to reach her. "Sarah, please don't do this. It doesn't have to be this way." She looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with sadness, but also with love. "I can't lose you, Dylan. Not after everything. I love you." Before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, directly toward the entity. The moment she did, an absolute silence enveloped the environment. The crows stopped cawing, the wind ceased, and even the tremors of the earth seemed to calm. The entity raised its hand, touching Sarah's forehead. The touch was light, almost affectionate, but the impact was devastating. Sarah let out a sharp scream, her eyes wide, and a black light began to emanate from within her, as if darkness itself were consuming her soul. Dylan, finally free from the force that held him, ran toward her, shouting her name, but when he reached her, it was all over. Sarah fell into his arms, her body limp and lifeless. The sacrifice had been made. Dylan held Sarah's body tightly, tears streaming down his face as he rocked back and forth, unable to accept what had just happened. The silence around them was deafening, and the entity vanished into the mist, leaving only the shadow of its presence. The crows flew toward the sky as if their mission had been fulfilled, and the cracks in the ground began to slowly close. The city was saved. The cycle interrupted, for now. But the price was too terrible for Dylan to bear. He knelt there in the middle of the street, holding Sarah, not knowing what to do next. The horror was not over. Even though evil had been temporarily defeated, the true terror now resided in his soul, the absolute emptiness of having lost the person he loved most. The silence was broken only by his tears. Dylan remained kneeling in the middle of the street, holding Sarah's lifeless body. The weight of his loss crushed his chest, making each breath more difficult. The silence of the city was disturbing, as if even the world around him was in mourning. Sarah's sacrifice had interrupted the cycle, but the evil they had awakened could not be contained forever. Something was wrong. He finally stood up, still embracing Sarah's body, and began to walk through the deserted city. The crows had vanished, and the streets, which once seemed to shrink under the oppression of the shadows, were now empty and quiet. Each step echoed surrealistically, as if the very air were pulling away from him. As he walked, a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if something were watching, waiting for him to give in to complete despair. Dylan struggled to maintain his sanity, but the vision of Sarah's sacrifice and the emptiness left by her absence gnawed at him from within. As he passed by the old town hall building, he heard a distant sound, something that shouldn't be there. It was like a whisper, low, almost imperceptible, but with a tone that sent chills down his spine. Dylan. The voice was soft, familiar. He stopped immediately, his heart racing. He slowly turned toward the sound. Could it be? Dylan. Hear me. It was Sarah's voice. He froze, unable to believe what he was hearing. The pain of his loss was still palpable, but that voice... Was it real? He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Perhaps it was his mind playing tricks, grief distorting his perception of reality. Or perhaps it was something more. Sarah? His voice came out shaky, uncertain. He took a step toward the building. The voice did not respond, but something drew him inside. The town hall doors, which had previously been locked, were now open. A dark corridor stretched before him, and the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air was thick with an invisible presence. Dylan entered. Inside, the silence was even more oppressive. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, each step echoing in the empty walls. The building seemed abandoned for decades, but something within it pulsed with an ancient, malevolent energy. Dylan. The voice whispered again, this time closer. He followed the sound, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. His heart raced, breath quickening. Fear and hope battled inside him. He knew something was deeply wrong, but he couldn't resist. He needed to know. Reaching a room at the end of the corridor, he stopped. The door was ajar, and a dim light shone from behind it. He pushed the door carefully and entered. Inside, the room was dusty, the walls peeling. In the center stood a figure, facing away from him. It was Sarah. Her body was still, dressed in the same clothes from the night of her sacrifice, but something was wrong. The light emanating around her was unnatural, as if she were enveloped in a shadow disguised as light. Sarah. Dylan whispered, his voice heavy with emotion.